Back in 2014, Reza Aslan came out with his book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, basically a collection of theories that actual scholars laughed out of the halls of academia decades ago. Unfortunately, I keep making the mistake of thinking that if a book is based on an absurd theory, readers will eventually catch on and stop taking it seriously. Since readers continually prove me wrong, welcome to Fact-Checking Reza Aslan. If you're not familiar with Reza, he's a professor of creative writing, although his PhD is in sociology. His doctoral dissertation was titled Global Jihadism as a Transnational Social Movement, a Theoretical Framework. So his doctoral work was on jihad as a social movement. But if you ask Reza why we should trust what he says about Jesus, suddenly his creative writing background kicks in and he creatively rewrites his resume.
I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. I am a historian. I am a PhD in the history of religions.
Yes, and if you'd like to see my PhD in the history of religions, it's hanging on the wall next to my master's degree in liarology from the University of Fantasyland. I should point out, of course, that I don't really care about Reza's scholarly credentials, apart from the fact that he lies about them. I'm concerned with whether he has any clue what he's talking about. Let's find out by reading a single paragraph from Zealot. There are plenty of freakishly bad paragraphs to choose from. I'm going with this particular paragraph because Reza's entire thesis hinges on it and because it demonstrates his utter incompetence. If you haven't read the book, Reza's thesis, in a nutshell, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a violent revolutionary, hell-bent on slaughtering non-Jews, but the Roman Empire crucified him before he could make the streets flow with the blood of the unbelievers. The obvious objection to this thesis is that the New Testament is filled with commands to love everyone and to live in peace with everyone. How could a homicidal maniac like the Jesus of Reza's imagination inspire the claim that God is love? Reza's response is that Christians made up a bunch of verses about peace and love because they didn't want to get killed by the Romans like Jesus did. But conveniently throwing out all these verses leads to a further objection. Some of the New Testament teachings about peace and love are actually taken from the Old Testament. Christians obviously didn't write the Old Testament, so how can Reza explain Old Testament commands like love your neighbor as yourself? This brings us to our paragraph of the day. On pages 121 to 122, Reza writes, "When it came to the heart and soul of the Jewish faith, the law of Moses, Jesus was adamant that his mission was not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." Matthew 5:17. That law made a clear distinction between relations among Jews and relations between Jews and foreigners. The oft-repeated commandment to love your neighbor as yourself was not Jesus' invention. It comes directly from the Torah and is meant to be applied strictly in the context of internal relations within Israel. The verse in question reads, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Leviticus 19:18. To the Israelites, as well as to Jesus' community in first century Palestine, neighbor meant one's fellow Jews, whether friend or foe. With regard to the treatment of foreigners and outsiders, oppressors and occupiers, however, the Torah could not be clearer. "You shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not live in your land." Exodus 23:31-33. How is this paragraph stupid? Let me count the ways. First, Reza cites Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to show that Jesus came to fulfill Old Testament laws about violently driving non-Jews from the land of Israel. Matthew 5 records a sermon of Jesus, and in verses 7 to 9 of the same chapter, Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Still later, in the same chapter and the same sermon, verses 43 to 45, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Now, as a rule, if you're trying to make the case that Jesus was a murderous psychopath, it's pretty odd to cite a verse that's sandwiched in between two great big slices of peace and love. If your method is to go through a text, pick a couple of verses that you can squeeze into your theory, and then throw out all the verses that conclusively prove your theory wrong, you can use this method to defend any theory about anyone. And if your method can be used to defend any theory, no matter how ridiculous, probably time for a new method.
To be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek. My job as a scholar of religions with a PhD in the subject is to write about religions.
Second, Reza quotes Leviticus 19:18, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," but he claims that in its original context, this only applied to one's fellow Jews, not to foreigners. Your neighbors are only your fellow Jews, so you only love your fellow Jews. You don't love foreigners. Here we have to wonder whether Reza bothered to finish reading the chapter he's quoting, because later in the same chapter, Leviticus 19 verses 33 to 34, we find, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Now think about this. In the New Testament, Jesus says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Given the other things Jesus says, it's pretty clear that Jesus means love everyone. But Reza throws out most of what Jesus says about loving people, insisting that Christians made these things up. That leaves us with the original meaning of love your neighbor as yourself. What did this mean in the Torah? Reza says that love your neighbor as yourself only applies to one's fellow Jews, and he quotes the verse in Leviticus 19. But right there in Leviticus 19, God says, in case you're wondering if you're only supposed to love your fellow Jews, let me make this so incredibly clear, even a creative writing professor masquerading as a historical Jesus scholar should be able to understand it. You have to love foreigners as yourself and treat them the same way you treat your fellow Jews. How could a self-proclaimed scholar of religions offer an interpretation that's the exact opposite of what the text clearly says, and then make this bogus interpretation foundational to his thesis?
I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually.
Third, since Reza didn't bother to finish reading Leviticus 19 and therefore has no idea that the passage commands Jews to love foreigners as themselves, he claims that the final marching orders of the Old Testament are to drive out foreigners and outsiders. And he quotes Exodus 23:31 to 33 as a command that applies to foreigners in general. "You shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not live in your land." Here again, we have to wonder if Reza bothered to read the chapter he's quoting to show that foreigners were to be driven from the land, since in the very same chapter, Exodus 23 verse 9, God says, "Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt." God again reminds his readers that whatever planet Reza Aslan is from, there definitely aren't any signs of intelligent life there. But it gets worse. The command to drive them out has absolutely nothing to do with being a Jew or not being a Jew. This command refers specifically to driving out the Canaanites, and it wasn't because of their non-Jewishness. They were to be driven out because of their practices, which, according to the Bible passages that explain why they had to be driven out, included sacrificing their children to the god Moloch, ritual sex with animals, and men having sex with their own mothers. Interestingly, in Leviticus 18, the chapter that comes just before the chapter Reza quoted but didn't bother to read, God says that if the Jews do the same things the Canaanites did, they'll be driven from the land too. After listing the charges against the Canaanites, God tells the Israelites, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you." So the Canaanites were to be driven out because of their actions, not because of their ethnicity. God tells the Jews that he will treat them in exactly the same way if they do the same things, and God says that the foreigners living with the Jews have to avoid these things as well. Not a word about driving out foreigners simply for being foreigners. In fact, just the opposite. The Torah assumes that there will be foreigners living among the Jews and orders the Jews to love them and not mistreat them. How could someone who constantly brags about being a scholar of religions get so much wrong in a single paragraph, especially a paragraph that's essential for the thesis of his book. Reza's imaginary PhD in the history of Western religions supposedly makes him an expert not only in historical Jesus studies, but also in Judaism, so how could he not even have a basic knowledge of the Torah? Well, there are only two possibilities here. We'll call this the Reza dilemma. Either Reza is shockingly ignorant. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Research for his book consisted of Google searching for verses that he could use, but didn't extend to, reading whole chapters. Or Reza does know what these passages say. He is the scholar he claims to be, but he's deliberately distorting the passages in order to deceive his gullible readers. So which is it? Is Reza ignorant or deceptive? There's no third possibility here. You can't be both well-informed and honest and make the sort of mistakes Reza makes. Normally, I would be charitable and conclude that a writer is simply ignorant. But Reza is so adamant that he's a scholar. He might be more offended at being called ignorant than it being called deceptive. So now we have to ask, why would a Muslim writer want to portray Jesus as a violent revolutionary obsessed with killing outsiders? Because at the end of the day, the goal of Muslim apologists in the West is to make Muhammad sound more like Jesus and Jesus sound more like Muhammad. There's a massive gulf between Jesus' command to love your enemies and Muhammad's command to fight those who do not believe in Allah. If you can make Jesus sound like a killing machine, Muhammad won't sound so bad by comparison. The difference between Reza and Muslim apologists who share his goal is that Reza focuses on dressing his claims up in scholarly garb so that he can pretend his conclusions are the result of a careful and sober examination of the facts. Sadly, this is enough to dupe not only Reza's gullible followers, but also the simple-minded media.
Welcome back, my guest tonight. He is a religious scholar, a best-selling author. His books include No God But God and Zealot. Please welcome back to the program, Reza Aslan.
As a religious scholar, as a Muslim, as an American.
Author and religious historian Reza Aslan.
Unfortunately for Reza, by making so many blunders, even in a single paragraph, by showing that he doesn't even finish reading the chapters he's quoting, by concluding the exact opposite of what anyone with the ability to read would conclude, he makes it very easy for someone to come along, quote the verses that contradict his thesis, demonstrate that he's either unfathomably ignorant or deliberately deceptive, and prove to anyone with any noticeable degree of intellectual integrity that the scholarship that went into Zealot ranks right up there with the scholarship that went into the Da Vinci Code.
Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.